Welcome to the project planning for Islandora migrations session at this open meeting. I'm Mark Jordan from Simon Fraser University. At Simon Fraser University, I'm an Associate Dean of Libraries for Digital Strategy and have been involved with a lot of migrations over the years, many of them to and from Islandora. My co-presenter and colleague today is Janice Banser. Janice, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, Janice Banser, and I am the Digital and Web Services Librarian at Simon Fraser University and have been involved in the project management role for a few of our projects recently, including our IR migration. Oh, okay, thanks. I'll try to up my mic here.
So our approach today is that we are going to get to some very specific Islandora considerations later on in the next hour or so. But before then, we'll kind of go from the general to the more specific. We'll start off with a general kind of refresher on project management in general, not just project planning. The focus of this session is planning, not overall project management and not execution. It is planning, meaning the phase, the early phase in a project where you assemble your plan and all the things that go into the plan. The execution of the plan, doing it, or the operationalization of the plan we're not going to cover very much because it's a whole different set of topics in a sense. But we'll start from a general project management review, really, and attempt to make that review relevant to migrations of repositories, in particular Islandora repositories. We're going to spend a little bit of time on some general issues around repository migrations that don't necessarily apply to Islandora, but we think will, but that are not Islandora specific, and then get into some Islandora specific considerations and issues. And we hope to have a lot of time at the end for discussion. I'd like to kind of expand on an adage we've all heard. And that adage is nothing can be said to be certain except death, taxes, and I'd like to add migrations. This is the business we're in, right? If you're in this session, you're using or about to use Islandora, and migrations are part of that life. They're inevitable, they're frequent, and I won't say that they should be joyful, but they certainly should not be seen in the same light as death and taxes. They're a task we need to do, and we need to do them often and well. So to begin the general project management overview, I'm going to do a slide or two, and then I'm going to hand it over to Janice. Just to kind of contextualize our presentation today, you often hear distinction between different types of project management methodologies or styles, waterfall and agile being the two most common. Waterfall is the older, more linear, in a sense, project management methodology, where you define requirements, you execute the project to deliver the requirements, and that line from project planning to completion is, I won't say it's straight, the direct line, because there's inevitably some modulation and correction as we go, but it's a fairly straight line from planning to delivery to completion. Agile is a lot different. It's really iterative. The goals are short-term. Typically, they change rapidly depending on feedback from stakeholders and users. And the implementation and the planning are not as separate as they are in waterfall. They're intertwined, and they're bundled up much more than they are in waterfall. What we're going to do today is a review of waterfall project management. My experience, I don't have a lot of experience with Agile, although I have some. And I think that for software development, Agile is probably the better methodology. For migrations, I would argue that waterfall is a better methodology. Be happy to have a conversation about that at the end of the session, but this is really from a waterfall perspective. And Janice, over to you.
Yep. Thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. If not, just give me a shout in chat. So I'd like to start by giving a bit of a shout out to a recent DLF symposium that I attended, where there were some really great project management templates that were made available and inspired a little bit of some of my notes. And I've shared a link to these and made them available. They're at the end of the presentation, and you're welcome to make a copy and use them yourself if you think they'll be useful. So I'll be dipping in and out of sort of project management concepts and then relate them a bit to some of the work we've been doing. And so there are about 4 main phases that we've been using for there are about 4 main phases, and we've been looking at implementation as being intertwined with all of them. The first phase is pre-planning and includes things like your organizational readiness, which Mark's going to talk about in a bit, and identifying your key team members, as well as working on your project scope. Planning includes things like creating your project charter, which is a key document, and following that is some monitoring. So this includes your regular team meetings, tracking your milestones, finances, and the deliverables. And then finally, wrapping up your project, you're looking at your lessons learned. This could include things like QA, quality assurance, and your maintenance plan. And that means who's going to maintain the platform or software moving forward, who's going to be your troubleshooting person that people contact, that kind of thing. Over to Mark for pre-planning.
There we go. So the first kind of phase of the project that Janice identified a minute ago was pre-planning, and this is really in preparation for drafting your project plan. But it does, it's an important, I mean, it's not, the distinction is a bit artificial, but it just emphasizes that getting some key things in place early is important. And if those are in place, then drafting your project charter and project plan will be a lot easier, because you know you have already worked through a bunch of issues that that are dependencies really on an effective project charter and project plan. So again, we shouldn't get too caught up and tied up in the distinction. It's just that it is useful sometimes to separate this process so that you can say that's done. Now let's move on to the next phase, and that phase is a useful kind of milestone in the project planning process.
Really?
The first topic I'd like to cover is organizational readiness, and this is really foundational. It is the very first thing that you should be talking about when you are considering a migration. And it basically means, are you ready to do this? Is your organization, not you as a person, although people make up organizations, but is your organization, including senior leadership, the project team, all the people involved at your organization ready? And the first question you should ask is, do we have sufficient resources and time to make this project a success? There's little point in embarking on a project if you know that you don't have resources and time, particularly resources. You need to have these things in place before you, like any other project, right? Like renovating a home, like going on a trip. You got to have certain things in place before you know you're ready to do this. And this question is not so much about money as it is about staff capacity. And if you're hosting the repository locally, infrastructure. Do you have the technical infrastructure needed to host an Islandora repository? There's a kind of a typical, I don't want to be too biased here, or a typical perception amongst a lot of senior library leaders, and maybe I won't speculate on how transferable that is to other leaders in other domains, but many senior library leaders think you can just throw money at a problem and solve it. It is not the case. Just pay a vendor to do it. They do it, easy. Why are we talking about this? That is not how it really works for most institutions. So even though you need money to do these projects, they are not all about money. I would say that they are about money and capacity. And I think an honest discussion about organizational readiness takes that into account. It is not just, can we afford, do we have the budget to do a migration? It is, do we have the budget to do a migration, and do we have commitment to make capacity within the organization to make it a success? Hard questions that need to be answered very, very early on when you are considering a migration. And of course, the assessment of organizational readiness should assume that there are going to be delays. And I mention this because there are almost always delays. And I think in particular, as the project grows in size of scope, that the delays, the likelihood of delays and the length or magnitude of delays is going to increase as well, kind of proportionately. This is important consideration for determining organizational readiness, because if you say, yes, we can do this, we are putting a group of staff, the local team, we're putting their other duties aside until the end of July. That's when the project is going to be done, end of July. Got that. And they're not doing their other work in that period up until the end of July. If there are delays, then the problem is that if they're still on the project team, they're not going to be able to resume all those things that they should have been doing in that time, and the other projects perhaps that you have planned after the end of July. So organizational readiness is not just a question about capacity now during the planned span of the project, time span of the project. It is a conversation about what happens if there are delays and staff XYZ can't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can't.
Oh, it was from, yeah, I remember.
Oh, Dean, I think your mic is on. Yeah, you can't. The staff local team cannot do things that you plan to do after the project. Next task in the pre-planning stage is to identify sponsors. And the distinction between a sponsor and project manager is sometimes not so clear. And in fact, they could be the same person, but they're different roles. The project manager is the person who makes sure that the team is organized, the tasks get done, and that everything is going according to plan. Generally speaking, other tasks, obviously, responsibilities in the role of project manager. But the sponsor, if the sponsor is separate from the project manager, the sponsor is the person who is typically a member of senior administration, because they're the ones who are going to the senior administration saying, we want $50,000 to this project. And because they are linking the project team and the library administration, I'll use library in this case, pardon me if you're not a member of the library domain, but in my own experience, and also taking senior responsibility to make sure the project is a success. And that means supporting the project manager. It means making sure that the budget that the project is given is spent according to how you said you're going to spend it, and also to flag senior administration or to warn them if things are not going exactly to plan and what the impact of that deviation from plan might be. They really have an important role in making sure that the organizational readiness that we talked about in the previous step is leveraged, right? So we have these resources, and the sponsor will typically be able to negotiate a little bit more readiness as necessary, for example, with other senior administration, for example. I just want to make the distinction between sponsor and project manager, because in large organizations in particular, this is a real distinction, and the responsibilities of those two roles are different. And over to Janice.
Thanks. So similar to identifying the sponsors, part of the pre-planning is identifying your stakeholders. You probably already have a good idea of who your stakeholders are. Their input and support are necessary for a successful project. In our library, academic library ecosystem, we have many potential stakeholders to include in our planning, including the obvious faculty and students and staff. But we also have librarians, metadata specialists, catalogers, and our special collections staff. And I'm sure I've missed some. I'm not going to do a laundry list. There's also campus organizations that we need to consider. So for example, we have CAL, which is the Center for Accessible Learning, which we want to include as a stakeholder. And then the library and university management and administrators. So that sounds like a
Good
large
question.
Sorry, somebody asking a question? Okay. Sorry. So it's a fairly large group, but we would just pull in as needed the stakeholders to get feedback and input and to help us know that we're on the right track. Yeah, sorry. So next we'll briefly look at the project scope. Thanks, Mark. And in the pre-planning stage, you need to really focus on this and try answering the 5 W's. So who are your end users, stakeholders, team? What is the purpose of the project? What are you trying to achieve? What is your objective? Why are you doing this? This is not an existential question. For example, is your software end of life? Our recent example is our IR, which is on about to be off, but is on Drupal 6. And finally, how are you going to move forward with this plan? Are you going to reach out to a service provider? Do you have in-house expertise? Some combination of the two? Do you know what software hardware you will require? So all of that is part of answering those questions to define your scope. A key part of the project scope is awareness of your time frame. How long do you have? Do you have time constraints? Any and all of these should be noted in your scope document. And finally, a very important piece is what is out of scope, what is not included. For example, maybe theming, if you're doing a website or a repository website, is theming included in the scope? Or custom development. So very important questions to know ahead of time. We'll look at scope a little bit later, but I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is working on the planning. So one more. Thanks. So defining your project deliverables. When looking at your deliverables, be specific. If a requirement has multiple parts or is complex, break it down to its component parts. Plan your project timeline around the deliverables. For example, if you have a deliverable that will require custom development, have you accounted for discovery, development, testing, and implementation of that requirement? We'll move on to resources. So identifying your resources, and Mark touched on this briefly as well. What resources do you need and do you have to manage and complete this project? So for your human resources, do you have staff expertise and skills in-house? Do they have the capacity? Do you need to outsource any work to a service provider? And that rolls into your financial resources. Time is key. For example, if you are using in-house expertise, have you accounted for vacation and staff capacity? If you're going to use external service providers, how does it fit in with their schedule? When can they put you in their queue? And then for us at SFU, as an example of policies and processes that we need to follow, we have a budget ceiling, after which there are administrative requirements that we have to follow. So we need to work with our procurement department if we exceed a certain budget. And all of this takes time and coordination. So you need to keep things like this in mind when identifying what resources are going to be needed. So next, we're going to talk just a little bit about the project charter. So the project charter is a guide for the project. It's a key document, and it's also included in one of the templates that you can look at, a really helpful outline. So your project charter may include things like the scope and objectives, your deliverables, your time frame and milestones, team roles and responsibilities, and your communication plan, which was on a previous slide, but I didn't really talk to, but it's very important to not forget about your communication. So you should be writing the charter as you plan the project. And the charter is intended to be an internal planning document. The audience for the charter is mostly your project team and, in our case, library administration. Invite review and feedback from your team and from administration. It's an iterative process, and it should be a flexible document. The charter is a very high-level view and summary of the project, and it should allow flexibility. So next up is Mark talking about project risks.
So an important part, in fact, I would include this in the charter, although I guess we didn't have room on the previous slide to identify it, but identifying project risks is important, because if you identify things that may go wrong, you can then formulate a plan or plans to respond to that happening, or to mitigate the impact of the risk. And when we talk about project risk, we can break down this kind of analysis into like their likelihood, the likelihood of a risk happening, the impact if it happens, and some things we can do to either prevent it from happening, or if it's inevitable and happens despite our best efforts to prevent it from happening, what can we do to respond? We have a plan, which will be very useful if it happens. I'm going to give some examples of project risk here, and even though this first part of our presentation is on general project management review, I just thought we'd make these risks a bit specific to the migration of repositories. But as you can see, I've broken down the risks. I've identified them in the left-hand column. I've estimated the likelihood on a medium to low to high scale. I've estimated their impact on a small to large impact. And then these, the exact scales you use or units in the scale don't really matter. The idea is to develop a sense for what can happen, how likely is it to happen, what if it happens, and how we respond if it happens. So for example, a risk that SFU will face, I'm not going to hide the fact, and we'll see some examples later, is inconsistent metadata values. Our mods is kind of a mess, to put it bluntly. And we identify that as a project risk in our migration from Islandora 7X legacy to Islandora 2. That's a known risk, I can tell you that. And we should identify it up front. The likelihood of it happening is medium. I think I would say medium because we know it exists. It doesn't exist everywhere, but there are certain pockets of our metadata that are problematic in this regard. The impact can be large, I would say will be large, because you want your metadata to be consistent. That's going to make everyone's life easier during the migration and after the migration. So the impact of inconsistent metadata I'm gauging as large. And I'm saying I'm gauging it, for example, as someone who is drafting the project charter for the project plan. What kind of risks can we come up with, can we identify, and we go from there according to this kind of structure. And how do we mitigate? What are some plans for mitigating that particular risk? Well, in our case, we have already, and we are going to audit and clean all metadata prior to loading it in the platform. So we have a plan. We know the risk is real. We have some idea of how likely it is to happen and what its impact will be, and we have a plan for mitigating that risk. I won't go through all of these, but you get the idea. The point here of this part of the project planning process is so that we are ready. If something happens, we've identified it, we know what we have a plan for what happens what we do when it happens. Of course, you're never going to recognize or identify or predict all possible project risks. But again, that's not the point here. No one has a crystal ball, but we can easily identify potential risks that we have had some indication that this is possible. For example, and the two middle ones here are pretty obvious, right? A key team member leaves during the migration. Staff come and go, usually, like often, and that's a risk that I think should be in every project charter, because it likely won't happen, but if it happens, it could be a big deal depending on how key they are. And I also think that there are very few projects, maybe your experience differs, but mine is like this. There are very few large projects that aren't delayed by some time. And I think it would be wise for any project manager to have accounted for what happens if there are delays. I include the last one because I couldn't come up with well, I came up with this because it has an impact of small, I think in our case, in SFU's case. SFU relies on Islandora for its digital preservation program, and premise is we want to be able to say in that program that we generate premise metadata. But if we determine that migrating that premise data from Islandora legacy to Islandora 2 was not possible or easy, it wouldn't be the end of the world. The impact would be small if we didn't do it. We could do it later on as a secondary project if we needed to, or do something else. But in the large scheme of things, even though we're talking about preservation here, in the large scheme of things, the fact that we can't migrate that data from one platform to the other, the impact is small. In our estimation, it may not be small for every organization. And again, the likelihood and impact columns will vary depending on organization, I would say pretty widely. Oops, wrong keyboard. Janice already touched on defining milestones a little bit, but I just want to underscore a few points here. I think that deliverables or milestones should be evaluated and determined against how achievable they are. It makes little sense to define a project timeline that is so ambitious that you can't realistically achieve it. So that's what I mean by that. The milestones, and milestones, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Milestones are points in time or deliverables, or things, but say points in time along a timeline of a project that are significant. So we'll see some examples a little bit later. But so the establishment, for example, one milestone could be the establishment of the infrastructure for the platform. That's done. It's something we can say at this point in time, we plan to do it and we did it, or we plan to get it done in this point in time, but we're having some issues, some challenges. So it's going to be delayed a little bit. The milestones it is important to get input from sponsor and stakeholders on the milestones to make sure, just to, as I said, a sanity check to make sure that they're realistic. And again, getting back to organizational readiness, these groups should be able to confirm for you that as a project manager or project planner, these groups should be able to confirm for you that the milestones you defined for the project are realistic. Or not. And as I've said a few times, and you'll hear me say a couple more times during the next half hour, you should have a plan for delays. Like, what if you don't make your milestones? What happens? Is your organization ready? If you're working with a service provider, are they on side? Will they be on side? And questions of this nature. which is a good segue into the next set of slides that Janice will talk about.
Okay, yep, next slide. So a part of monitoring is regular check-ins. I'm pretty sure we all do this, but it's worth reviewing. It's a good idea to schedule right at the start regular standing meetings with your team, whether it's once a week, twice a week, every day, whatever works for you and your project. It helps keep everyone on track and will allow you to catch potential issues early. We use GitLab as a tool for a lot of our project needs, including identifying issues and challenges. And a lot of discussion happens there and problem solving happens there. And then it gets folded back into our regular standing meetings where we do our check-in on those issues. So it's been a really helpful tool. Don't forget to schedule a kickoff meeting. At that point, you can agree on your frequency of meetings, establish everybody's availability. All of these things can help the smooth running of your project. Just something you already know, but I'm going to mention it is make sure your agendas are action oriented. This is where GitLab helps. And you can always do ad hoc meetings, which we've had to do when needed. Did I miss anything? Yeah, no, I think that's it. So Mark's going to talk a little bit next about tracking spending.
Can you hear me? I had to turn my mic off for a second.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, part of monitoring is tracking spending. And this is like if you got a budget and you're expected to spend that budget in a particular time frame and not go over it. Or no, you can go over it by a certain amount. These are all important things to know up front. But typically you would only, like if you don't include internal staff salaries and costs as budget, which some organizations will, but if say you're really talking here about the amount of money that you're paying a service provider, it's important to make sure that you're on top of the cash, on top of the burn rate, as some people call it, which is the amount of money over time that you're depleting. Usually when you are working with a service provider, the billing and payment schedule is defined in the contract. Let's say something like, the service supplier will invoice SFU on a monthly basis for all hours spent on task in that previous month or something of that nature. The language will vary, but the idea is that you have this pot of money, you have this length of time, and you need to make sure that you're spending it out at the rate that you predict, and not all at the end. This is really important because if the service provider is giving you invoices every month, then you're spending it out, right? But the problem there, the task there is to make sure that the invoices you're getting line up with the amount of work that you know that the service provider is doing, and that you're all on the same page along that axis. You don't want to run out of funds early, and you don't want to bunch it all up at the end. And in particular, I'm not sure what this is like. I'm talking here from the perspective of someone who works at a publicly funded institution. Fiscal year of the institution is a big deal. To carry money over into the next fiscal year is a big deal. And typically, like for SFU and most institutions in British Columbia, the public institutions are funded by the province, and this varies by province, and it probably varies by state for public universities in the US. Even though the fiscal year might end on, for example, in SFU's case, the fiscal year runs from April 1st and ends on March 31st. That's the fiscal year on paper, but the actual deadlines for spending in that fiscal year are different, because the finance office at SFU needs time everyone at SFU is spending money late in the fiscal year because they know they can't carry it over easily. So the work increases at the end of the fiscal year for finance office staff. So that means that they define these deadlines that are not March 31st. They're more like March 10th. something of that nature. And so you got to keep those in mind. And I'm only focusing on this because it can get pretty hairy at the end of the fiscal year where, you're collecting all the invoices. You're getting finance manager saying, can you get another invoice from such and such a service provider? Because I've got $20,000 I need to offload or spend out by the end of fiscal year. So tracking spending is a super important part of project management. And if you plan for it adequately, it will be a lot easier than if you just say, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just get invoices and pay them. It's much more complicated than that. Along with tracking the burn rate of your budget, it is tracking deliverables and milestones. They're often tied to spending. Of course, because if you have a service provider and they're doing work, defined unit of work, then and they give you an invoice for that, then that makes sense that they're tied together. With regard to tracking the deliverables in relation to the milestones you've set out, the next point is important, and that is dependencies. So presumably in your planning process, you have defined your milestone, your deliverables and milestones, or planned your deliverables and milestones such that things that need to be done before the next task or deliverable can be done, there's a sequence there usually. So in the case of, say, repository migrations, that is, the metadata needs to be clean and ready to migrate before we do the migration, an obvious example. Variance reports are summaries on like a monthly basis, for example, of how you're doing with regard to staying on schedule and certain deliverables that you decided should be delivered at this time or completed this time. It is useful to do these reports because it is a kind of a high level, they form a high level longitudinal view of how your planning, how successful your planning was and how your execution is going. And sometimes you need to be able to inform the people who gave you the money to do this, that you're on track, you're not on track, because here are the things that they're not on track. So these reports are the kind of expression of those things. One of the most common ways of tracking a project or monitoring a project is using a Gantt chart. This is just a kind of an abstract example that looks nice with this theme. There is a real live example that Janice has put together, linked in the template links at the end of the presentation. But many of us have used these before. It just lays out tasks on the y-axis up and down, and timeline on the other axis, and plots, sometimes with color coding on various stages of completion and so forth, what the status of a particular project is. Deliverable is in the context of the whole project. Next thing I'll talk about is lessons learned, and this is an important part of project management. It's not really project planning, but the lessons learned are what people have called post-mortem of a project. That is to say, at the end of the project, we document the challenges and successes and recommendations for next time. So this is where the lessons learned in a project can feed back into project planning for the next project. Because if we learned something in the last project, whether it was something we did really well or something we didn't do well and we had a hard time recovering, what we learned during those experiences should feed back into the planning for the next project. And also they do a secondary purpose of documenting lessons learned is because they're useful for reporting out to, again, to your sponsors, to your stakeholders, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, here's what we'll do different next time, or how we can improve as an organization and improve our project planning, management, and delivery processes. So I apologize in advance for this wall of text, but it is intentionally a wall because it is copied verbatim from a lessons learned document that I asked one of my teams to do. It's one of the challenges. A minute ago, I said there are challenges and successes. This is a challenge. And you won't understand what this is until you know what Radar and PIDIO are. Radar was SFU's research data management repository that ran from 2015 or so to 2021. It was an Islandora 7 repository. And in 2020, we decommissioned it, and we decommissioned it under duress. And by that, I mean, we had a plan to decommission it because we decided we weren't going to have a local RDM repository because of various reasons, but we will rely on external data RDM repositories for research data, external to SFU. And we had this plan, and we were in the pre-planning stages of the project. And our central IT services said, we are taking down the old cluster, meaning the VMware cluster that this infrastructure that this repository was running on in 2 months. And we weren't the only ones running on it. There were hundreds of other VMs running on this cluster. This was an urgent issue that central IT needed to address. I won't go into details, but we were one of the victims of this expedited migration. So we needed to migrate this thing in 2 months, where we had a 10-month project timeline. So as you might expect in that kind of compressed timeline, there were a lot of challenges and some successes. This challenge here it just basically articulates, what one of the challenges was, and that was that we hadn't gotten to the stage of the pre-planning process where we had really gotten a good handle on some of the facets or aspects of the data that was in this repository. And we had some active users who we didn't expect to be active. PIDIO was it was a service running on the same server that was like a local Dropbox. PIDIO is a piece of software, but it was local. It was running on the same server as Islandora, as the Radar as Islandora, and they were integrated. So that's what PIDIO is. The response to that challenge, and again, the team members wrote this. I didn't write it. I was the sponsor, and I and one of the team members shared the project management seat. But she wrote the response, and she also delivered some recommendations for next time to mitigate that particular challenge should it happen again. This will be, I'm making these slides available to you later, so you can read it if you want. Then, Janice, over to you, I think, again.
Yep, thanks. Next slide, please. Yep. So, we've already talked about the concept of project scope, and so we'll just dig a little bit more into that now. And one of the things you need to look at is whether there's anything new or custom that you require for this project. You should identify what the functionality is in your current system that you want to keep and make sure is available in the new one. You need to think about hosting. Do you need to think about this now? The answer is yes. And metadata, big thing here. If your metadata is like ours, Mark referenced this earlier in our digitized collections, it's been touched by many people over many years, and we have many different collections. So you can imagine how various and interesting that metadata is. So you need to start working on cleaning your data as soon as you can. Look at what transformations might be required. Are you going from mods to Drupal fields, which we are? And who's going to do that work? How long will it take? Have they started already? Do they have the tools they need, the experience they need? All these questions that you need to think about. And what tools can you use? OpenRefine is one. We used Google Sheets for some of it. So there's a lot of choices there. Next slide, please. So we've talked about deliverables a few times, and So here we're going to talk a little bit about our particular case recently. And there's a link in the at the end of the presentation to our spreadsheet of requirements / deliverables for our IR, where you can see how we organized our requirements or deliverables and how detailed we got. And, you know, in retrospect, sometimes we just needed to get more detailed. So we identified 5 main categories that we used to define and organize our deliverables. UI, so the user interface, metadata, admin, so that means administrative functions in the software, and integrations, and then we had the other category. I don't think we populated that too much. We tried to keep things very specific. Some examples for the UI, we didn't have breadcrumb navigation in our old system, and that was one of our deliverables or requirements. For administration requirement, we wanted defined user roles. So for example, we wanted a role that was an IR maintainer, and we wanted a role that was a designated submitter. So I think we had three to 5 roles that we wanted defined. We also included a wish list in case we were able to include sort of not blue sky, but deliverables or requirements that we were hoping could be included. We also defined our content types and the fields that we wanted in each. And you can see all this in the spreadsheet. So this was a document that went through many iterations and edits, and we had lots of feedback, which we just kept working on this and refining it and breaking out our requirements from complex to less complex to more defined. That's it. Okay, Mark's going to talk next again about project risks.
I am, and before I go to that slide, though, I just want to ad lib here a little bit. Janice, you set me up for this really well. Thanks. So earlier on, I said that this presentation, the review anyway of the general project management would adhere more to, or would represent more the waterfall approach rather than agile. But here's an example based on what Janice said of where we had to, I wouldn't maybe call it agile, but a waterfall process kind of verged over into agile a little bit. And that was around the roles that Janice identified. We had the Drupal roles. We had wanted a set of roles and a set of workflows that would involve users in those roles and be specific to users in those roles. But based on some project overruns in terms of schedule, for example, timelines, we, in collaboration with the service provider, decided to change the requirements in this area because we just didn't really have enough resources and time to do what we had set out to do. This was a risk that we hadn't identified, so we didn't have a plan, but we managed to recover from it fairly easily. But we got lucky in that case. Again, just to maybe move on now to project risks. You can't predict everything that's going to happen. You're going to go wrong. But in the case I just mentioned, where we had to kind of pull back on some requirements, that was a suitable plan. It may have turned out that it wasn't a suitable plan. It may have turned out that we couldn't identify any requirements that we had set out for the project that we could give up. Like in other words, we were able to give this one up. It may have had a different outcome. We may have not been able to do that. So, and I'd share this anecdote simply to underscore the importance of trying to identify project risks. And here, given that we're in the part of the presentation that is on project planning for repository migrations, and a couple more examples of risks that are going to apply to many migrations and many organizations during a repository migration, whether it's Islandora to Islandora or something else to Islandora. And these are real risks, they're not samples. These are real ones that you should watch out for. Existing workflows and processes will change. Like at SFU, we've really gotten used to using data stream CRUD to fix things. And that's not going to be possible in 8, Islandora 2, because the downstream CRUD is not, it's meant for Islandora legacy. We know that the likelihood of existing workflows and processes changing is high. I think it's kind of almost given for us, and the impact is going to be large. So we need to figure out how the mitigation strategy here is how do we need to identify processes and tools that we have been using for these many years in Islandora 7, and figure out how we're going to do this. Figure out, first of all, if we're going to need to do the same sorts of things in Islandora 2, probably yes. There are going to be botched loads where the metadata is wrong, or where the wrong files were loaded, or what have you. We need to figure those things out. But first, we need to identify what those things are, and then from there, identify the kind of processes that we are going to need to be able to do when we go live with our new repository, and figure out how we're going to do them. Another risk that is certainly to happen is that local staff who run the repository are going to need to develop new skills and expertise. Again, this is high. I would say it is more of a medium impact in this case, because people are, generally speaking, if people are supported, they can learn new things easily and often want to. But we need to be able to have a strategy or a plan for helping repository staff learn those new things as they need to. And if we have that plan, then it will all work out. Yeah, Janice has already gone into some of this a couple of slides ago, but just to reiterate that, so one of the project planning, very important project planning tasks that you need to do during any kind of repository migration, and certainly during Islandora migrations to Islandora 2, are making sure that your metadata is in a state that is ready to migrate. So you have to be honest with yourselves about what the general state of your metadata is in Islandora, let's say in Islandora legacy. What is, and I know this is a huge topic of conversation in the Islandora community, it has been for a number of years now, but what is the mapping, not the technical process, but the kind of conceptual process and the content process of the metadata? What is the mapping from the old metadata to the new metadata? And is it possible or easy to articulate that mapping? If it is not one-to-one, which it will rarely ever be, and it certainly isn't in Islandora legacy to Islandora 2, you need to identify as part of your project like a deliverable or a process. What processes will need to be put in place to facilitate the transformation? How are you going to get your metadata from what it is now to what it needs to be to load into the new system? And just to continue that list, this is an important aspect that we're thinking a little bit about now, because we see room for improvement in our migration to Islandora 2 on our in both our institutional repository, which, as Janice said, is coming to a close now. That was a nervous laugh, by the way. And then starting to plan for the migration of our large repository, which we call digital collections, from Islandora 7X to Islandora 2. How will the transformation of that metadata impact findability and discoverability? And talking about things here, such as because Islandora 2 uses vocabularies extensively, will that transformation from non-controlled vocabulary lists or non-system controlled vocabulary lists to controlled vocabularies, will that improve discoverability in terms of consistency and facets and things of this nature? And also, are your identifiers portable across platforms? So that includes URLs, which I'll talk about in a second, but identifiers, in the case of a migration from Islandora 7X to Islandora 2, in Islandora 7X, we had the idea of this PID, which was a unique and immutable identifier for an object in that repository. It wasn't unique and immutable. Well, it wasn't unique globally, but it was unique within that repository. What do we need to keep in mind when we migrate those identifiers to the new platform? And will the new identifiers continue? Will the old identifiers continue to act as unique identifiers in the new platform as well? or will they simply be a piece of metadata that is no longer that important and not machine actionable, for example, as an identifier? URLs, if you have URLs in the old system that you don't want to break in the new system, what are you going to do? What is your plan for that? Do you create URL aliases? Things of this nature. You need to kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at your metadata and assessing it for readiness to migrate to a new platform. Just let me catch my bearings. Janice, I think this is yours.
Yep, thanks. So I know we've talked about milestones a few times, but here's sort of a short list of milestones that can be defined. Content preparation we've talked about before. It's a very important piece. Don't underestimate the amount of work and time that is required to prepare your data and the value in doing so. Mark's talked about some of the risks if you don't do it, or some of the backpedaling or work that you have to do after migration. A related question that we are facing right now is, when do you freeze the upload of content into your old system after you've already had a migration into the new system? And then when and how do you get all that content in? Something to consider sooner rather than later and have a plan for. For the platform, what does the platform require? Is configuration required? Who's going to do it? How's it going to happen? This is something we faced in, Mark talked a little bit about how we had to claw back a few things off our deliverables. So we're having to do a bit of configuration. Yep.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, and configuration management, like learn how to do that.
Yeah. Can you give an example?
Oh, so I'm sorry. Yes. We have a dev to staging to prod workflow for changes in our repository, in the new institutional repository. And we, part of the learning that we needed to do to be able to make configuration changes in, say, a development instance, to make sure they work, and then to get those from the development instance to the staging to make sure the process worked. Then if everything in the configuration worked in the staging server, we're ready now to move it over to the production server. So that's what I meant by configuration management. How do we do that in the context of a Drupal 9 website?
Yep, and that was and is still a big learning curve for us, but we're getting there. Thanks. And then your migration plan. Who's doing the migration work? What is your plan? What is your timing? And then don't forget quality assurance. So testing your data once it's in the new system. How does it look correct? Do searches work? That sort of thing. Post-migration and pre-launch, identify the work that must be done after the content has been migrated, but before you launch or go live, and what can be done after launch. We're in this stage right now. And again, I know I've talked about GitLab before, but we found it really useful for tracking this work. I have a screen cap of what that looks like in GitLab, and that'll be the next slide. So we'll go there in a second. And then also don't forget about your communication plan. I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's a template for that as well at the end of the slides. So use clear and targeted communication, identify your audiences and your modes of communication throughout the project, not just at the end. Okay, let's take a look at that screen cap. So this is just a quick capture of our list of post-migration and pre-launch tasks. Each task is labeled whether it's must be done before we launch, that is go live. Each task is linked to a GitLab issue and is tagged with the person responsible for completing the task. And you'll see we have a little bit of work left to do. And now on to Mark.
So again, we've already talked about defining roles in the project team, but just in the context of repository migrations again, it's important, particularly around the data quality. So in the case, for example, because the service, if you're using a service provider, they may expect to receive fully cleaned, perfectly importable metadata from you, from the local, from the client. And if that metadata does not meet those criteria, whose job is it to fix it? So that's important to clarify up front, so there are no surprises. And if it is an issue that the client has caused, that's a risk, right? That's a risk that you could have identified. Maybe you didn't identify it, but whether you did or not, you need to have a plan for rectifying it, and that has implications for capacity and all sorts of timelines and all sorts of things. Typically speaking, if you are using a service provider, the language in the contract will clearly identify what they are responsible for and what they're not responsible for. This is important to have in the contract, and it's likely that your procurement office will require it. But I guess the devil's in the details too, many times, where the procurement office knows nothing about your business, right? They're just making sure that the contract is legally okay. But the understanding between the service provider and the client around the boundaries of responsibility is extremely important, and can be addressed in regular check-ins and things like that as well. We're going to move on in the last few slides to some specific Islandora legacy and Islandora 2 considerations. We've already covered a few of these, both in the general project management review and also in the last few slides, talking about non-Islandora specific issues with migrating repositories. I think I'm talking for the next couple of slides. So one of the first things to do in planning an Islandora migration from Islandora, the legacy to Islandora 2, is the functionality review. And this is something that I think a lot of people who are doing this right now, doing the planning of migration, are grappling with. And that is, does Islandora 2 have the functionality equivalent to Islandora legacy had if you were using it? I mean, if you're not using certain functionality, the lack of it in Islandora 2 is not going to be not going to be a showstopper at the moment. But if you were using something in Islandora 2, in Islandora legacy, Islandora 7X, that is not yet in Islandora 2, or it will not be in Islandora 2, then you need to know about that and plan for it. And I'm linking here to the very fine feature parity 7 to 8 spreadsheet that Rosie and others worked so hard on to document. Now, mind you, this is back, I think, in March, so the last time it was updated, so it's maybe a little bit out of date, maybe not, I don't know. But it's worth looking at for sure, because it identifies the things in Islandora 7X that existed and their equivalent functionalities in Islandora 2. So this is obviously going to be a very important document for sites that are migrating from Islandora 7X to Islandora 2. And because it is possible you will identify things that are not ready in Islandora 2, that should feed back to your project scope and goals and timelines. So if you absolutely need something in Islandora 2 that is not yet production ready, you need to decide if you're going to pay for it, basically pay a service provider to deliver it as part of your migration, hopefully to give back to the rest of the Islandora community. But again, the point here is, if you do the functionality review between Islandora 2 and Islandora legacy and Islandora 2 early, you're going to be prepared to deal with any gaps that you think are necessary to deal with. Custom functionality. This is going to be interesting for many sites, because in Islandora 7X world, it was pretty easy to customize your site fairly heavily. So a lot of sites, including ours, well, we didn't have a lot of custom functionality, honestly, except for two important exceptions. We have two custom content models, and I'm sure a lot of other 7X sites have custom content models too. But the two that we have are pretty obscure, and we're not going to, no one cares about them, I don't think, in Islandora 2. The two custom content models are what we call XML, which is not metadata XML, like mod style. This is more like docs, like doc book, like narrative documents marked up in XML. We have a couple of collections that have that. We developed our own solution pack called the XML solution pack, and we're not going to do that again. And we're also not going to develop that functionality for Islandora 2, because we realized it was an interesting idea at the time, and we did it for a couple of DH or digital humanities projects, but not really interested. No one's really interested, including the collection owners, and these are faculty members, in moving that forward. And the other one is an early attempt, again, based on a faculty member's research, to create a custom content model for OHMS audio, interviews, oral histories, sorry, the OHMS stands for oral history. And we have an elaborate, we have one collection, only one, that is uses this system that we incorporated into a custom solution pack that we're going to just convert to straight up audio with transcripts in the new Islandora. Not going to carry those custom content models forward. And that was a decision that we haven't decided that fully yet, but because we haven't finalized the project plan for our large general repository migration, but that's the way it's going to go. So we talked about making decisions about metadata a few minutes ago, and in general context, here are some specific Islandora to Islandora migration questions. How will you accommodate structures possible in mods but not possible in Drupal fields? That's an obvious one for all of us. How important, and that's something that the metadata interest group has already spent a huge amount of effort on, which is documented in things that link from the wiki there that we link. And secondly, and something kind of a personal bugbear of mine, is how important is RDF mapping to your institution? Do you have real use cases for it? Or like in our case, we don't. Honestly, I would love to hear real use cases for RDF mapping at scale for every field. I can see their benefit in taxonomies and whatnot, but like mapping every Drupal field to an RDF property, I don't really see we don't see the value proposition. See value, we don't see use case. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that initially. If we want to do that after the fact, we will do it, but not as part of our migration. Moving into some specific tools here just for a few minutes and pretty rapidly, because I know we're a little bit running behind. In order to assess the quality of your metadata, you're going to have to use some sort of process and some sort of tool set to do that. And it could vary depending on your own local workflows or your own local staff expertise and things of that nature. But one of the tools that we have been finding really useful to get a sense for just how bad the problem of metadata inconsistency is in our large 300,000 object repository. As Janice said earlier, it's been touched by a lot of people over a lot of years. And because SFU had chosen early on to define the metadata content model, like the metadata model, basically a set of fields and what goes in those fields on a per collection basis, as opposed to a content model basis, which is would be the convention in 7x. We have a lot of different variations, and we need to get a handle on those variations in order to prepare the metadata for migration to Islandora 2. This tool, Islandora Get CSV, is a module that I wrote a couple of years ago for this specific purpose. Well, not this specific purpose, the specific purpose of determining how many different values. Sorry, this is the wrong tool. This one is getting your metadata out of Islandora 7x into CSV. I'll talk about the other one I just introduced in a minute. That's a separate tool. This one, Islandora Get CSV, it basically lets you, it provides a menu option within the collection management interface. It's circled in red there on the left. It says generate CSV file of metadata used in this collection. And if you click on that, you get the lower screen web page, excuse me, that lets you generate the metadata it takes the metadata directly from Solar. It's not coming from your mods. The origin of the metadata is your mods, but it's gone through that indexing process and normalization process to get it into Islandora Solar. And the spreadsheet you get out is the raw Solar values with the raw Solar field names that you can then use as the basis for cleanup or auditing or what have you. And we use this tool for every collection that we have to get the CSV out, that we then handed to our metadata librarian, who undertook a project with some staff in her area to clean up the metadata and make it more consistent, and to do things like address some of the issues we'll talk about in the next couple of slides with the variance in values between fields, but also to do things like some authority control on names and things of that nature. So that's one tool you may find useful in preparing for your migration from 7x to Islandora 2, Islandora Get CSV. Next tool, which I've already said a couple of things about prematurely, is Islandora Field Values. And this is a tool that will let you identify a solar field. And when you identify the field, it then tells you all of the unique values in that field and how many times they occur. And then it also links to a Solar query that where you can see the results. So you can actually see the records where the value that has the value that's linked. So this is, I would call, an easy to use and high impact tool, because it really does expose your dirty laundry. And it's pretty sobering to see this. This is a real life example I screenshot a couple of days ago from our digital collections. This is about 300,000 objects. It's our main general Islandora repository. And this is the mods genre field. The S at the end, underscore S at the end is a Solar specific field type indicator. Don't worry about it. But it's the mods genre field. We have in that of about a little shy 300,000 objects. We have 303 unique values in that damn field. This is bad. I don't want to overstate the case, but really you should have about 20 or 30. I think that would be something that I could live with, but 303 is not cool. And I take full responsibility for that, since I was the senior officer on watch during this time. Again, how this works is, if you click on editorial cartoons, you get a result list that shows you all 11,000 items in our repository that are tags in Islandora 7 that have editorial cartoons as the value of the mods genre element. So you can imagine how this might be useful, right? You take a field of interest, let's say genre, since again, I think you could get by with 30 values in a large repository. That's arguable, but let's say 30. And if you find out that you have 300, then you got a task ahead of you, and that is to look at those records and figure out how you're going to go from 300 down to the target value. And in Islandora 2, that is a vocabulary, right? Most sites are going to implement that as a controlled as a taxonomy. So the values that your target values are going to be the entries or members in your Islandora 2 genre vocabulary. And our task is to prepare our CSV files so that we get all these divergent values down to that set. I think this is pretty much our second last slide. So we talked about making decisions about metadata for the last few slides. This next set of slides is, the next slide is about making decisions about media or data streams. So it is possible using tools like, the Drupal migrate framework, and also things like Alan Stanley's Get Islandora 7 7X content, I think it's called, script that's he contributed to Islandora Workbench. Those are two strategies, and maybe others, for getting media data streams that were in 7X over and create media in Islandora 2. But you will want to think about which media you want to do that with and which ones you want Islandora 2 to regenerate. This is important for things like thumbnails, because the thumbnails that may have been suitable in your Islandora 7X site may not be suitable for some reason, like the size or what have you. You've changed look and feel, so your generic thumbnails are different, things of that nature. You think about this process or this decision, whether you're going to take over all those data streams and make them, one-to-one relationship to media. OCR, I would argue the OCR is worth migrating, because generating OCR at scale is a pain in the butt. And you may have gone in and corrected OCR in your Islandora 7X site. So just migrate it, I would say, but your local mileage may vary. Thumbnails, I would probably lean toward regenerating them, unless you have custom thumbnails. That is to say, thumbnails that are not generated, from PDF or something straight up. And the big question in this set of decisions around media is: does your legacy Islandora legacy repository have any custom data streams? A lot of sites have added custom data streams for whatever purpose, license information, whatever. The way that Islandora 2 has been set up by default is that there are a set of media use tags that can be added to or modified, but on a local basis. But the set of target media use tags is really the universe of media that Islandora as a repository platform has a use for. If you have additional ones, you can certainly add them, no problem. But the functionality that you had in Islandora 7X that used those custom data streams needs to be thought about as you migrate, because it may need to be developed in Islandora 2. If the data streams that you added, the custom data streams you added to Islandora 7X were things like license information, which are there simply as a good place to keep administrative data, then there's a good chance that you just migrate them over, create a new tag in Islandora 2, migrate the media over to be a data stream, the data stream over to be a media in Islandora 2, and no loss in functionality. Again, your local situation will govern what you need to do here. And this is our last slide. So another set of decisions you need to make when migrating from Islandora 7X to Islandora 2 is the non-descriptive metadata, or non-object content. And this sometimes gets overlooked, but you need to worry about user accounts. If you've got an Islandora 7X site that has a whole bunch of users, people in your community, and that includes roles as well, you'll need to figure out a plan for migrating those user accounts and roles over to Islandora 2. And if you're migrating roles, how do those roles work in Islandora 2? They probably don't work in exactly the same way that they did in Islandora 7. They may, in terms of an abstract function for that role, but they probably not work exactly the same way in terms of the permissions and the workflows that you set up in you had set up in your Islandora 7 repo when you move it to Islandora 2. Access control. Islandora 7X has XACML. Islandora 2 doesn't have XACML. So I've kind of lost track on the status of work to replace XACML-based access control in 2, but I think it's pretty far along. So that there's a shift there in non-content, right? The shift there is in access control lists and mechanisms for enforcing them. Usage statistics. Islandora 7X had Matomo. I don't know how many people used it. It also had the core Islandora usage stats module, but Islandora 2 has adopted Matomo. If you want to migrate usage statistics between Islandora 7X and Islandora 2, I don't think that there's a standard process for doing that. you'll need to figure that out or work with the community to figure it out as a group, as a community, so we can have a migration path for that data. And finally, fixity auditing data. This is in Islandora 7X, we had Islandora checksum checker, and in Islandora 2, we have riprap. And that it is possible to migrate data from the Fedora objects in Islandora 7 into riprap, but it's not an automatic process. There's a way it's possible to do it, and there are some scripts around, but it's not an automatic thing. So again, this is the final example I'll give of data that you may want to migrate from your Islandora 7X repository to your Islandora 2 repository that is not, object content. That is all of our content slides. We have a couple of attribution slides. The one I'll highlight here, and Janice, maybe you could talk about this for a second.
Hi, sure. Yep. So the link to the Google folder contains some project management templates that were available through the session I went to, which is also linked at the bottom of that slide. If you use them, please just make a copy and move them over to your own space. And then we also have a link there to our recent IR deliverable requirement document or spreadsheet, and feel free to take a look. Thank you.
And that link at the bottom, Janice, that's the recent project management symposium that you attended?
Yes, it is. So it's been uploaded, I forget to where, it's like an open science repository. So it's a link to the slides of Dinah Handel, I think her name was. Sorry, I should know this. And so you can also look at her slides. And the templates are linked there as well, but I've just put them all together. And there's a few we didn't talk about, but you can probably figure out what they are.
So that's it. Thank you for your time and attention. And our emails are here, but we're also both on Islandora Slack. I think it's probably easier to find us if you have any questions.